In the early morning of March 25, 1944, the crew of a bomber prepared to take off from a remote island base in the North Pacific on one of the most risky overwater bombing missions of World War II. With a full bomb load and extra fuel tanks to reach its distant target, the dangerously overweight bomber climbed into the freezing night, never to return. The fate of this bomber and its crew of 7 remained a mystery for more than half a century. Until in 1999, a letter arrived at the US Embassy in Moscow containing pictures of the wreckage lying on the slopes of an isolated volcano in the Russian Far East. After 56 years, Bomber 31 was found, and the story of its crucial role in a little-known campaign of World War II is finally emerging. But what's unknown is what happened to the crew. Did they survive the crash? And if so, what happened to them? At the extreme far east of Russia lies the Kamchatka Peninsula. Although larger than Great Britain, Kamchatka has a population of less than 500,000. With no overland route into the Siberian wilderness, it's cut off from the rest of the world and remains largely untouched. In this land of volcanoes, there are few roads, and helicopter is the main method of transport. Crash investigator Ralph Wetterhahn has come here to write about Bomber 31, which lies 2,000 meters up the slope of Mutnovsky volcano. He'll try to determine what happened in the last minutes before the crash. This will help him decide if any of the crew survived the landing. Ralph Wetterhahn is a former Vietnam combat pilot and military crash investigator.
Okay, this is the central stabilizer with the rudder on it. We can see the Navy PV-1 and 34641, which is the bureau number of the aircraft, and down below is 31. And from that we can go back and identify who the crew were. And the archives show that the pilot of the plane was Walt Whitman. And the co-pilot, John Hanlon. Also aboard, navigator Don Llewellyn. He was married with a young daughter. And radio man, Sam Crown, was yet to meet his new baby boy. Clarence Fridley, the plane's mechanic, was still a newlywed. And you've got gunner James Palco, orphaned as a child. He'd lied about his age to join the Navy. Jack Parlier wanted to get in the action, voluntarily swapped places with another weatherman that night. It would be his first and only combat mission. On this particular engine, you can see battle damage under the prop spinner, and there's a big hole, and an explosion has occurred up in here. So we know it was hit with something, and it could be anti-aircraft fire from the ground, or it could be a Zero or a Zeke aircraft shooting at the bomber. The engines had some type of battle damage. You can see here where a projectile has come through the exhaust stack on that cylinder, and also in this area here. So if we can assume, at least for a little bit, that both engines were damaged, that would give us reason for the pilot to want to put it on the ground because he couldn't hold altitude. That tells me that he intentionally put it in here because he had serious problems. He may have had fog down below in the valley he couldn't see. And he saw this flat area out in front of us here, and he brought it in and put it down very level. The airframe went uphill. These engines, the props caught in the snow and were ripped violently underneath the wing and wound up together down here. So that pilot and that co-pilot, there's a good chance they were injured. His last moments, his last full measure was some kind of fabulous flying to get that airplane in here. But I have to tip my hat to what Whitman and Hanlon did in those last minutes here. Just some amazing stuff.
The plane was the PV-1 Ventura, originally designed for the Royal Air Force in 1942 as a long-range precision bomber. Built by Lockheed, it was renowned for its ability to fly like a fighter and absorb battle damage.
Oh, it was a rugged plane. There was no way you could tear it up, I don't think, if you tried, and we tried.
The PV-1s were robustly built. Rudolph Toney and his crew survived a crash landing in one. Airmen who flew the PVs regarded their chances of surviving a crash as better than average, so the likelihood that the crew of Bomber 31 survived is high. But how did this bomber get here, on the slope of an isolated volcano on a remote Siberian peninsula? The only American airbase within range of Kamchatka was the tiny island of Attu, 1,000 kilometers to the east. Attu is the most westerly of the Aleutian Islands that crossed the North Pacific like stepping stones. It was an isolated outpost on America's northern flank. In 1942, Japan had Attu squarely in its sights.
Whenever you look at your world globe, the shortest way from Tokyo to America is what? Right up that way and right over.
In June 1942, the Japanese invaded Attu. It was the first time since 1812 that American soil had been held by an enemy. National pride made recapturing the island imperative. US forces landed in Attu in May 1943. One of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Campaign followed. After nearly 3 weeks, Attu fell after the surviving 400 Japanese soldiers committed suicide, the largest mass suicide of the Second World War. With Attu back in American hands, an airfield was quickly assembled within days. Constructed from thousands of steel plates called Marsden matting. But Attu was a dangerous place to fly out of. Situated where a warm current from Japan meets the cold Bering Sea, storm centers form, causing the worst kind of flying conditions: gale force winds, dense fog.
It's cold, it's always foggy, it's always damp and everything.
That island was only about 10 miles one way and then 20 miles the other. We had a saying, there was a lady behind every tree. There was no trees.
We seemed cut off from all the rest of it. Everything else was down south in the warm Pacific, you know, and here we are freezing ourselves up there. So we thought we had our own corner of hell up there, you know.
As General MacArthur's forces swept across the southern Pacific, the airmen of Attu felt cut out of the action, but they wanted to play their part in the Pacific Campaign. They devised a plan to draw the Japanese away from the main battle zone in the south by tricking them into thinking that America was going to invade Japan via the Kuril Islands in the north. To convince the Japanese that the threat was real, the Navy bombed the island fortresses of Shumshu and Paramushia, 1,000 kilometers from Attu. This was one of the longest PV's overwater bombing missions of the war. If an aircraft ditched in the ocean, the crew's chances of survival were virtually nil. Twin 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines gave the PV-1 a top speed of 515 kilometers per hour, fast enough to outrun Japanese fighters.
Now here we have the top gun turret on the PV-1, and you can see it here. The plexiglass is gone, and the two 50 caliber machine guns have been removed. But they were mounted here, the gunner sat in the middle, and this aircraft was operated pretty much like a fighter when it was coming down here. These guys were bomber pilots, but they had a lot of guts because they were taking on Japanese Zeros and Zeeks with no fighter escort. And what they used was this 50 caliber and speed. And this was an aircraft that was very fast on the deck. They'd be right above the water, the wave tops. And if you tried to approach from behind, this gunner would take care, and there's another gun underneath here as well, any of the Japanese aircraft that would come in. The key problem, though, is you had to have two really good operating engines. If you lost one, you were in deep trouble. And if you had a problem with both of them, the only thing you could do is try to make Kamchatka, Petropavlovsk to the north here, and that's what I surmise they were doing.
Just 275 kilometers north of Shumshu, the bomber's target, is Petropavlovsk, the capital of Kamchatka.
They had an airport there that you could land on if you got in trouble, but you got to get to the airport before you could land there.
Whitman's plane never made it to the airport at Petropavlovsk, crashing just 65 kilometers to the south. But Ralph Wetterhahn has found evidence that at least one of the crew died here.
And looking down in here, there's lots of debris, but you can see some bone material that we won't disturb so that the Central Identification Lab people can come in and do the proper procedure on it.
But a fragment of bone is not much to show for 7 airmen. Did the others survive the landing and try to walk through the deep winter snow to Petropavlovsk? The Lockheed PVs were stripped of armor plating so extra fuel tanks could be added for the 10-hour mission to bomb the Japanese island fortresses. Whenever American troops in the southern Pacific planned a big push towards Tokyo, bombing raids from Attu were intensified as a diversionary tactic.
It's important because it had an effect on the outcome of World War II, a very important effect, and in that it caused the Japanese to move squadrons and naval forces to the northern Kurils to protect against an attack or potential attack by the United States from the north. And in that process, the General MacArthur's forces that were coming up from the south had less Japanese resistance to deal with. And it's as simple as that, but it was very important, and it was carried out by such a small force, a small unit in terms of the aircraft involved, but the contribution was immense, and the story hasn't been told.
In the early hours of March 25th, 1944, the crew made their way to Bomber 31, one of 5 planes preparing to bomb the Japanese island of Shumshu.
They show up the aircraft, their faces are covered with grease to protect themselves from the frostbite. They do their pre-flight and scamper aboard the aircraft and start engines and warm up all the systems. Taxi in the fog down to the end of the runway and shut down because there's a fuel truck waiting there to refill their tanks to squeeze every drop of fuel inside those airplanes. At that point, they're 3,000 pounds over the maximum allowable weight for that airplane.
Took about 1,400 gallons of gas, I think, and the plane wasn't built to carry that much without the bomb load and everything that we had on it. But we tried it anyway, and we got away with it a few times.
On the runway, Whitman and his crew waited as the bomber ahead of them took off.
Well, taking off, I think, is one of the most dangerous things because we were overloaded, of course, 2,000 pounds, and we could never get any altitude. We'd get 50 feet in the air, and the plane was just mushy.
Everyone watched in horror as Jim Moore's plane crashed into the bay at the end of the runway and exploded.
I felt water coming up, and I had flight boots on. One of them was jammed under the rudder, and I pulled my foot out of the boot without unzipping it. And then I came up on the surface, and I yelled, "Let's go over to the life raft." I was, of course, yelling for the other 4 fellows, but never heard anything from them. Everybody after the cockpit was killed.
It was then Whitman's turn to take off.
So they're at the end of the runway. They refuel, and with this dangerous smell of gasoline still in their nostrils, crank engines and immediately release brakes and head down to Marston Matting, rumbling along over this plank runway into the air and climbing up into the fog, and 750 miles on their way.
The 4 remaining planes made their way to the Kurils in appalling weather. 2 of the bombers failed to find their target and turned back. Only one succeeded in dropping its bomb load over Shumshu. Bomber 31 simply disappeared. Today, what happened to Walt Whitman and his crew is about to be resolved. Unique amongst governments, the United States spends $100 million a year to bring home the remains of its missing servicemen from around the world. Flying to Kamchatka is a 10-person recovery team from the US Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, led by forensic anthropologist Ann Bunch. Her job is to find the remains of the crew and take them back to the United States for identification. During the Cold War, Petropavlovsk became a top-secret Soviet military and nuclear submarine base. A Korean airliner that strayed into Soviet airspace here in 1983 was shot down on the suspicion of spying. Kamchatka only opened to foreigners just over a decade ago. This is the first recovery mission of its kind permitted in Russia. The team brings all its own camping supplies for the 4-week excavation, and that includes 7 tons of bottled water. But a snag with customs causes problems. They won't release the water until import duty is paid. This, plus bad weather, causes a week of delays. Finally, the camp is set up, complete with laundry lady, tent heaters, DVD and showers. Keeping watch for bears are half a dozen local hunters. Kamchatka has one of the densest populations of brown bears in the world. From the campsite, the wreck is a mere hour's climb over the shoulder of the volcano. But already the team has some information on how many survived the crash. A geologist who now lives in Moscow was part of a survey team that discovered the plane in 1962.
То, что мы нашли останки 4 человек, это можно считать факт. Куртки, вот остатки курток лежали, личные вещи, которые мы нашли, говорят о том, что, в общем, 4 человека там около самолета погибли.
But who were the 3 that survived? Despite this evidence, Ann Bunch intends to do a major search for the remains of all 7 crew.
Here for as long as we can stand it today. Okay.
It's a lot of wreckage here.
Yes.
A big site. How much digging do you think you're going to need to do to clear it?
I would like to do, a square encompassing this entire frame here. Then I'd like to test some areas, just dig some test pits up and down the site, just to make sure that we don't have any other remains or personal effects or life support there. Whether it's metal or it's tiny levels of dirt, you have to do it very carefully, very systematically. It's the romance of archaeology, as one of my graduate professors used to say. It's very time-consuming, and it takes a lot of patience, and it's not Indiana Jones. Dirt and tubing, right? I think the effort we put into this work, as far as time and money goes, is worth it for two reasons. For the families that are left with questions, and it really is hard for them to have nothing, no proof that their loved ones perished somewhere far away from home. And I think also for the people who died here, because they were fighting for their country, and they wanted to go home too, and that was one of their thoughts, I'm sure, as this happened.
I was making cookies to send Sammy when we got the word, when Mother got the telegram. Sammy was missing in action.
Tom Raines was only a 10-month-old baby when his father, radio man Sam Crown, went missing.
He loved all kinds. Tommy, here's I believe, the last letter that Mother received from Sammy before he was missing in action.
And I see in reading this, he's talking about reunion and that he was confident that both Grandma and he and you would be reunited very soon. I want you to know that I carry a copy of this around with me in my wallet until it fell apart. I bet I had it 25 or 30 years until it just disintegrated. I always thought that there was always that possibility that one day someone would knock at the door and it'd be a father that had been missing for 15, 20 years, whatever it might have been.
Tom Raines hopes that Anne Bunch and her team will identify his father so he can finally receive a burial with full military honours. But first he wants to see where his father perished in Kamchatka. The recovery team has now searched through most of the wreckage for human remains. The discovery of an unexploded 500-pound bomb shows that the crew of Bomber 31 was not able to drop their bomb load on the target. Underneath the cockpit, Anne Bunch is looking at a parachute that suggests some of the crew were in the plane when it crashed. But only a few bone fragments are turning up.
I think that the idea that 7 are here, I have my doubts. So I'm already biased, but I'm not going to stop looking for them until we feel that we've excavated the whole site thoroughly.
After a week of searching, Anne Bunch's team is still unable to find evidence that all the crew died in the crash.
Hello, you fighting officers of the Pacific?
2 days after Bomber 31 went missing, the voice of Japanese propaganda, known as Tokyo Rose, reportedly broadcast the name, rank and serial number of every member of the crew, and even used John Hanlon's nickname, Moose. But how could the Japanese have this information?
3 different people heard 3 different stories. One was that the bodies had been recovered, another was they had their flight jackets, and the third was that they had them prisoners. So, there's always that possibility if his remains are not on the plane, then where was he? Did he bail out? What else could have happened to him?
Could some of the crew have parachuted out of the crippled bomber and been captured by the Japanese? Bomber 31's target that night was Shumshu Island, just a few miles from the southern tip of Kamchatka. Jim McDougall is a Pentagon investigator looking for missing American airmen in Russia's Far East. He and Ralph Wetterhahn are going to investigate a report of the grave of an American pilot on the island. Shumshu has been deserted since the war. Bomb craters still scar the landscape close to one of the Japanese airstrips. Planes from Attu regularly bombed this island and its neighbour, Paramushia. The Kuril Islands became Russian territory in 1945, after the war was over.
Now we've come over to the coast of Shumshu Island, where there's a couple of Japanese war memorials. We're going to have a look at those because we have a report that there's an American pilot from World War II buried. So we'll check the cemeteries at a minimum and hope we can find something there.
Ralph Wetterhahn wants to inspect the Japanese defences that may have prevented Bomber 31 from dropping its bomb load.
This is the fishing village and the port facility that the aircraft from Attu were attacking. And it's a bit far from here to see any military installations clearly, but I can look up on top of that hill over here and see some man-made structures, and that's probably where they put AAA anti-aircraft fire, so it would have a good field of view on incoming bombers. They probably put some on this hill as well. And if you look right in front of me here, you can see what appears to be a bomb crater. And I saw earlier 2 other bomb craters in a string down there, and that's pretty typical of what you'd see when an aircraft drops bombs out of a bomb bay. They're gonna string along, and this would be one area that they would want to hit. In addition, the aircraft were strafing the ships that were in the bay here, and as we saw further to the north with the airfield and the guns, this was a pretty hot area. There was a lot of things going on here back then. This is an amazing sense of history. The village looks totally deserted, and you wonder about all the stories and all the lives that went on in those places and now have just disappeared into the fog, as it were.
These bombing raids from Attu proved to be one of the toughest missions of World War II. Fearing an American invasion, these Japanese islands were now heavily defended. This, combined with bad weather, took its toll on the airmen of Attu.
They lived and flew out of an island that was simply a rock that was covered in fog and ice, climbing into weather that would test the most proficient navigator, the most proficient pilot, and having to do it through 750 miles over this cold, leaden Bering Sea.
I never saw the Bering Sea calm. It looked like it was always angry at you, you know, ready to reach out and grab you.
We didn't have very good, any navigation aids were, reliable up there much. And there weren't any reliable maps. It was, virgin territory.
They had to fly 5 hours in just bad weather until their 10 minutes of stark terror over the target area. So the gunner would have test-fired his weapons, and those little sounds would start coming through, and the heart rate's going to go up, and the adrenaline starts to pump. And as you get in close to the island, you start to see the flak come up, and then everybody's eyes are out looking for bogeys.
Keep you cool until you get out of the battle, and then just shake all you want to. As long as you're in battle, keep you cool.
And they know this is it. This is the 10 minutes where we either get it done or they get it done to us. And then turn around without fighter escort and get out of there in one piece and do the same thing all the way back and find this island in the middle of all this water. And a lot of them didn't. And they knew it taking off, that there was a good chance they wouldn't come back.
Well, actually, 2 or 3 degrees off, and you could miss one of those islands. They seem to have shrunk in size, when you're looking for them over 700 miles of open ocean,
The investigation team finds no American graves on Shumshu. As they cross the narrow strait back to Kamchatka, they spot the wreck of another airplane.
Here we go, right here. Some reading. Oh, look. Right here. PV1. So we've confirmed that much.
What do you got down here? Look. There's
Three.
a 3.
3-0.
It's exactly the same type of bomber as the Whitman plane. But this PV-1 belonged to a different squadron and was forced down by anti-aircraft fire during a raid on August 20th, 1944. The crew escaped the burning wreck with only minor injuries, including radio man Rudolph Toney.
When we started walking down toward the beach, 2 Russian soldiers come with rifles. And Jack remembered that Russian was Amerikansky. And when he said Amerikansky, that Russian grabbed him and bear hugged him like he was a long-lost brother.
Rudolph Toney's pilot deliberately crash-landed on Russian territory, knowing his crew would be safe. The Soviet Union allowed crippled American aircraft to land on its soil. Officially, the airmen would be imprisoned, but secretly were returned to the United States. Records show this is not what happened to the crew of Bomber 31, but there may have been survivors of the crash landing.
Они каким-то образом выбрались из самолета, то есть они не погибли в момент столкновения с землей. Их не выбросило, а они как бы вышли оттуда. Может быть, они были ранены, может быть, они были в плохом состоянии, но, по-моему, они не погибли вот в момент удара.
Mikhail Kotin saw a largely intact plane. Why is the bomber a mangled wreck today? The answer is provided by Konstantin Golumbovsky, the Russian government representative at the crash site and a colonel in the Russian Air Force.
Положили, что около самолета лежат не разорвавшиеся бомбы. Ну и для того, чтобы не случилось там несчастья, через какое-то время на это место садилась экспедиция на вертолете. И саперы взорвали боеприпасы. Они взорвали все не разорвавшиеся бомбы, кроме одной. В настоящее время там лежат зажигательные бомбы.
When the KGB came up in the 1960s, they cut the airplane into sections and moved things around, probably to disguise the plane from U.S. spy satellites.
Ну, я говорю, что вот я помню 2 кольца обручальных, больших, массивных таких, золотых, и 2 бригета. Вот.
Это все было передано с докладом о том, что обнаружен самолет. Куда эти вещи делись потом, нам не удалось найти следов. Документов об этом нет.
Чем больше мы задавали вопросов, тем строже на нас смотрели и старались, чтобы мы этого не помнили ничего.
To discourage any further questions, could the KGB have buried the bodies of the crew? One of the local hunters with the recovery team has spotted what he thinks could be graves.
What was he saying?
He said that it looks like a grave, you know?
I never think anything's a red herring anymore. I always follow every lead just because if you have a doubt, then you've got a bias. And I just think that you shouldn't go into any scientific endeavor with any bias at all. You have to keep an open mind up until the last day.
So what you going to do about it?
We'll have to follow through and dig these depressions.
3 potential grave sites are marked out, and the team starts digging. Tom Raines and his wife Kathy arrive in Petropavlovsk.
I certainly hope that things work out, that we're able to find some remains for my dad. I would be disappointed, but I'm certainly looking forward to this.
At the crash site, Anne Bunch is frustrated in her search.
We've proceeded down a foot, but it's not going to lead us anywhere as far as remains are concerned.
But finally, after days of searching, there is a breakthrough.
Yeah.
Underneath the cockpit area, several bones are found.
So we'll mark where that came from, and we'll get, I'll pop it into my map. Okay, what I have here is a sketch map, very schematic, of the site. Basically, different things are going on. We have the excavated area, which is this square shape here, and within that, we have the outline of the wreckage. And the little letters dispersed around the wreckage are actually where remains were found. And you can see they're clustered near the large piece of wreckage, so I think that served as a protection for them from the elements, from other creatures that were around the area. We found remains there, human remains, and the most important in my mind were two right clavicles. Every person has a right and a left clavicle, and so since we have two right clavicles here, I know from the anatomy of it, they're both right, that we have two people for sure represented at the site.
In order to identify the bones, DNA will be extracted from them and compared with DNA from relatives of the 7 crew. Crucial parts of Mary's genetic sequence are the same as her brother's, John Hanlon.
All right, now take the tourniquet off.
I didn't get his looks, I don't think. But he was handsome. He had other characteristics other than being athletic and handsome. He was a great guy. I think they gave their lives for this country, and I think that's the least the country can do is finalize their death or whatever happened to them so that we will know, what really was the outcome of it all.
Another important discovery is part of a flying boot with navigator Donald Llewellyn's name on it.
One of the workers drew it to our attention, actually, that there was a leather boot fragment on the surface about 300 meters north of the site. It also shows that the site was disturbed by animals and was probably dragged away from its initial location. So it's another indicator that there was disturbance going on here.
The most likely animal to have removed human remains from the site is the brown bear, and there's increasing evidence that the bears are coming closer and closer to the campsite. In Petropavlovsk, Tom and Kathy are ready to fly out to the crash site.
This is it. Long time coming.
The flight gives Tom Raines an idea of the difficult terrain his father's stricken bomber had to negotiate, especially during the winter with high winds and temperatures well below zero. But even in the summer, the weather is temperamental and can change by the hour, especially in the mountains. A heavy fog has moved in, and the helicopter crew finds itself lost. There's a problem reading the coordinates for the camp.
Наши координаты? Да. Курс и километр нужно знать. Километр и курс. Сейчас.
It seems pretty apparent that the pilot does not know exactly where to go. The coordinates we thought we had locked in, and it's still not working very well. It's very, very frustrating and very disappointing, too.
The helicopter is running low on fuel, but the crew is prepared to give it one more try. With worsening weather conditions, the camp is finally sighted. Shortly after Tom and Kathy Raines arrive, a fierce storm hits the camp. The weather halts work on the crash site forcing everyone in their tents for shelter. Overnight, several tents belonging to the recovery team are blown over.
I think it got around 40 degrees last night, and the tents are not holding up. So there's a lot of concerns about people's health and safety right now, and that's obviously the first thing we have to take care of before anything else happens.
A Russian border guard helicopter flies in to take Anne Bunch and her team back to Petropavlovsk. On board is General Roland LaJoy, Chief of MIA recovery missions in Russia for the US military.
Tom, you really shouldn't have high expectations that there will be significant skeletal remains of your dad. I think the nature of the crash, the 56 years that have elapsed, the prevalence of wild animals around here, argue against, significant remains. But hopefully there will be some remains that, with the help of DNA, can be specifically linked to your bloodline, and then those will get a proper resting spot in Arlington.
If it's just one, that's all it takes. That's all I'm really interested in. And that would be, I think, enough closure with the military funeral at Arlington. That would certainly be enough for me.
By morning, the weather has cleared, and Tom Raines finally gets the chance to see the wreck of his father's bomber.
Seems so small, in comparison to the landscape and the mountains and everything. And I don't know, I guess I was expecting it to be much larger for some reason, and on a much grander and larger scale than it is. And it seems so small and somewhat insignificant among all the mountainside and the volcano and everything here.
Terrible loss for somebody I never knew. It doesn't seem possible, but it is.
Not much to show for 7 crew members' lives. I guess my concern still is always about how they actually died, and hopefully it was quick, and maybe they died on impact. Because I can't really imagine, looking at this, how beautiful it looks and everything at this time of the year, how this place looks in March. It's got to be a pretty scary thing, especially if you are wounded or if you were hurt in the crash itself. Actually, I'm not too crazy about even thinking about that possibility of what it might have been.
I have a sense for the last few minutes of flight of aircraft 31. My sense is they were crossing this valley from Lopatka, trying to make it to Petropavlovsk, about 35 miles to the north, where they'd be in turn. And as they crossed the valley with both engines damaged, it became apparent at some point that they were not going to make it. And looking to his right, Whitman probably saw this relatively flat area and turned into it. And he had one priority, and that was to not have a fire. He's got a bomb load, he's got tons of fuel on board, and he brings it in low, and he calls for Hanlon to shut off the mixtures, then to shut off the fuel valves, and drops a little bit of flaps. Then the battery and generators come off. And then in the last few hundred meters of silence, he brings it in and pulls up, touching down perfectly level. Both engine props dig into the deep snow. The engines are ripped from the wings, go underneath, and the aircraft continues on up the hill and comes to a stop. And there is no fire. They've done it. I think the crew survived the landing, though some of them may have been injured. You know, they had fuel to stay warm and a little bit of food. Looks like 4 died at the crash site, and the other 3 probably went for help at some point and perished in the appalling winter weather. And I suspect the Bears dispose of their remains. No one will ever know for sure.
Japanese war records reveal that the airmen of Attu succeeded in their mission. They convinced Imperial Command to divert about 1/6 of their air strength to defend the northern Kuril Islands from invasion.
These Navy men, they created a mission and they made a difference because they could have all survived the war sitting there on Attu, drinking beer and smoking cigarettes while the rest of World War II happened, and they didn't. They took part in it.
A flower of American youth. May the repose of his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.